an independent director and very sought after business strategist of the country, being an alumni of the 1977 batch of Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad.
Market research is not about what do you want to know, but why do you want to know.
I mean, will you acknowledge that today, I think there is a cohort of the new CEOs who are thinking of the customer.
But the minute you believe that your valuation tells you that I'm driving customer value, then you are smoking dope. I swear, but certainly Indian women do that. So you do a certain set of things so that it gives you freedom on another set of things.
And should we learn to sugarcoat more in the corporate world?
But I write whenever I am fed up enough of the world to want to scream and say, you guys have got it all wrong, listen to me. Is the corporate world for you an umbrella or is it a vehicle? I mean, I was feeling really bad that meant I did not survive in the corporate world. I didn't do well in the corporate world. Which shop do you buy resilience? In which shop do you buy the ability to not fall apart? And we've now lived long enough to know that shit happens in life. As much as the good things happen.
How many of these companies fail because of lack of business strategy and how many because of operational effectiveness? Today we have a legendary thought leader who possibly doesn't need any introduction at all. But I'm going to attempt listing out, in no particular order, all her achievements over her 45-year-old career, starting from being an alumni of the 1977 batch of Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, moving on to being a long-term visiting faculty and a governing council member of her alma mater. She is an erudite and very sought-after business strategist of the country, and author, a founder, and an independent director on many, many large blue chip companies and social institutions, a mother and a confidant for very many CEOs that this country has produced. So happy to have and be in conversation with Mrs. Rama Bijapurkar, an absolute honor, ma'am. Thank you so much for hosting us on a Sunday and agreeing to do this
My
for
pleasure.
us. For the cause of inspiring women through their careers and navigating their journeys. So, slight break away from the usual pattern. So, I have about 3-4 chits. So, you can pick up any one of them.
You cannot do this to me on a Sunday morning when I'm brain dead.
And you can tell us what you feel when you read it.
Oh gosh, we are like that only.
Love
Yeah.
the title. I think it's...
Yeah, it is the title of my first book, which I wrote actually because I just felt that there was so much BS around who we were post-liberalization and so much stuff around fact-free theories. I used to work for a very large global consulting firm at that time, and all the theories of what India was going to be and what it had become. So I thought it was time to write straight from the heart, and it was We Are Like That Only. A lot of people say to me, We Are Like That Only means, screw it, we're not going to change. But I don't think so. I think it was said very correctly by my guru and mentor who wrote the foreword to my book, C.K. Prahlad. And he said, listen to the logic of consumer India from within. So I think We Are Like That Only basically means listen to our logic from within us. What appears illogical is really logical.
Yeah.
And so let's not try and change what is so core and DNA to us, and it will evolve when it will evolve. But let's respect it. Let's understand it, and let's lift off from there. That's what it means. Okay.
After this.
Ahmedabad. Wow. I went to Ahmedabad when I was 18 years old. I went to IIM Ahmedabad at 18. My father didn't want me to go. He said something like over my dead body. And I left. I graduated when I was 20, but I never really left because it has been my spiritual home for a long time, the IIM. So Ahmedabad, I don't know about the city, but certainly IIM is very special to me. And when I went at 18, I was just telling some batchmates of mine I hadn't even learned how to comb my hair. I had very much longer hair at that time. My mom used to comb it for me. So Ahmedabad to me was really a rite of passage. It was growing up. It was where I met my husband. It is where all my closest friends come from. Yeah, it's also lovely clothes. It's fabulous food.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so
Absolutely.
yeah, it's terrific shopping. It's all that, yes.
Yeah. Ma'am, thank you so much for that. So moving on, your childhood. You grew up in Delhi. Is that right? to
No, I'm
say?
actually an army child. So I grew up all over the country as army children do. But the last year of my school, I moved in the 11th, and the last year of my school and college was in Delhi.
Was in Delhi. And you chose to do physics. You went to Miranda House.
Yeah, I didn't
to
have
do-
much of a choice. My parents, I come from a South Indian family with all the South Indian baggage that goes with it. So there were subjects that were solid subjects and subjects that were not. And so my father was kind of conservative, and what he did is he said no to IIM, but on the other hand, he wanted me to go to IIT, which I had no desire to go. My brother went there. And so the compromise was physics. I went to Miranda House because all my friends were going to LSR or Miranda House, which had no physics. So you had to have you had to be in the college, but you had to go to the University Department of Physics in those days to do your stuff.
Right, right.
And as I was telling some friends yesterday, I said, I was the science type. So all the cool people were doing sociology, history, geography, English. And the science
that's quite
types
cool
were
to
the very
hear.
uncool types, and so we were really the lower class in that sense because we didn't do any of the cool stuff.
So how did the decision for an MBA how did you navigate
I
that?
did a lot by serendipity. So if I hadn't got into, my father wanted me to do an MSc and a PhD in physics and get married, and your college and how it's good for the family, and it's kind of a low stress job. And he in fact did a calculation for me on how per hour an executive gets paid as much as a teacher, because the teacher does fewer hours. So there was a lot of that, and I think it was just something you did. You didn't know you did it. Everyone was doing the exam. You did the exam. If it wasn't that, maybe they'd made me do the IAS exam. Who knows? And I got into both Ahmedabad and Calcutta, and having gotten, I was like, and because he said no, I was determined to do it. And I had no idea what it was, what we were going to do.
So you also mentioned, ma'am, that IIM was not gender colored. You were how many women on campus at that point?
8. There were 8 in each year, so there were 16 of us, and there were about 180 was the class size. So there were about 360 people, and so those were the ratios, and about 16 women. So my class had 8 to this. And I think it had no rules. You saw men in the women's dorm, women in the men's dorm. People came, people went. There were classes in the evening. There were collaborations late at night. So in some senses, it was a wonderfully gender neutral place. I mean, of course, everybody in my batch got married to someone from the batch, more or less, except for me. My husband was doing his PhD, and he was also doing a little bit of teaching assistantships on campus, and that's how he used to kind of do some stuff with us. But so that's why everybody on campus got married to everybody else on campus in my years, which is not so now, because I think now no one's in such a mad hurry. But there were lots of lasting friendships.
Right. So then moving on to your placement, I think you mentioned that the banks didn't come in that year, and so it was slightly more gendered.
Yeah, the foreign banks used to take a lot of women, and so I remember the guys saying that, "Oh, yeah, we're really sorry for you because this year no banks are coming." And there were big companies that came with women need not apply, and I've also written a little bit, which I'm not going to repeat here, about the interview process, which in today's day and age would be unthinkable that somebody could even ask you questions like that.
Yeah.
But I think in those days, we didn't know better, and I think they didn't know better either. So that was the year and the year before us when a whole lot of, we were the first lot of MBAs that went into advertising and market research and so on and so forth. So I think we just took whatever.
You went into manufacturing, or you went into?
No, I went into advertising the first year. It was 1 year. And so that year I went into advertising. I spent a year in advertising, did not like it, and then that was Lintas, and they were setting up a research company at that time. And so then I moved to market research, and then I kind of felt I'd found my calling.
So moving into the, into the space that you've kind of carved out for your own over a period of time, I read in your book, you mentioned that part of it stems from what no one else sees. You use it to describe a CEO and his strategy and thinking. And I honestly feel that, I think it applies in real life to you. Because maybe, from the examples that you quote, whether it's a kurti example or whether, it's how cleaning products or ready to eat food, the examples that you give every time comes from a very, very deep insight. So you are seeing the world, you're seeing the consumer dynamic, you're seeing the world in a very, very different perspective. And, is that why you kind of at that point of time decided that what the consulting company was doing or what is happening at a consumer level needed to change? Was that, is that how your thought leadership, am I right to say this?
I think so. I think I understand. I think I understand what you've understood of what I understand. But you're right that as long as, so firstly, my training, my work training and experience has been around the consumer view to solve business problems, right? That's what market research technically does. So you talk to loads and loads of people. In my generation, you did qualitative, you did quantitative, you did whatever the hell you had to do. So if you had to understand the algorithm for conjoint analysis, you understood it. And if you had to go and moderate a group in Coimbatore or somewhere deeper south, Tirutani or wherever, you just went and you did it.
Right.
So it was a 360-degree view of understanding people and how consumers look at things as compared to how businesses look at things. And so you went back and you told companies, oh, this is what the consumer sees. And of course, they said that's rubbish. The consumer doesn't know. This is what it is. And so you spent a lot of time trying to reconcile the two worlds, the world of supply and the world of consumers, and trying to build a bridge between the two worlds to see if business problems could be solved. So that is the core of what I do, what I believe in, right?
Right.
So as long as I was in the market research business, over time, over the years, and then I did a short stint actually at Hindustan Lever. It was full-time consulting, which kind of changed the way I thought about things, where I spent a year just tracking Nirma. And those were the days when the low-cost model was not clear, where Nirma started, and I've written about this in my book Customer in the Boardroom, but where Nirma was taking everybody's pants off, we didn't understand how it worked. So I spent a lot of time then on the supply side, looking at where you get your cost right, how your cost positions get lower, and in those days it was still new. It was Michael Porter had just come out with his competitive strategy analysis. So to think about the supply side a little bit. And then after that, I went back to Marg, where I was their deputy managing director. And at that time, there was an increasing restlessness in me that we looked at markets, we looked at consumers and the consumer view of markets. We did market research the same way, let's say in food, whether we were looking at it for Kellogg's or for Haldiram or for Levers. So we never looked at markets through the lenses and the filters of the company that we were looking for. And that seemed wrong to me, because clearly if you are the champion, you look at it one way. If you're the challenger, you look at it another way.
Right.
So I started looking, and also before that, in fact, in my acceptance speech for my Market Research Society of India Lifetime Achievement Award, I talked about between Levers and between my first job, there was a company called Mode, of which market research company I was co-founder, which is now sold to a large multinational. Mode was a bunch of guys from IIM Calcutta, and I set up Bombay for them. And that's where I met just the most amazing man who taught us. In fact, the three of them together, their philosophy was that market research is not about what do you want to know, but why do you want to know. So I fashioned the whole market research course that I took over from my teachers and co-taught with them in Ahmedabad, and their philosophy was exactly the same. It started with, why do you want to know?
Right.
So we would ask students to do one-line submissions and of the topic, and the submission was to understand the demographic profile of credit card users. We would return it with a red ink thing saying with a view to doing what. And they would hit us for it. Yeah, it was the whole decision-orientedness of the market research business that I think was the special sauce that I had learned from there. From Mode, and particularly
from working with this cohort.
Yeah, and I've also talked about it earlier, so I won't repeat it. But his name was Shilu Chattopadhyay, and I remember he would literally tear my proposals page by page, and we were taught to write proposals where every page was a particular thought, and you had a therefore underneath, and if you read all the therefores, you should get the story. And it was so of reports. And one day he told me, he said, can you go to the next room? I said, yeah. He said, can you take all your computer printouts with data and put them in the other room? And I went and I put them, and he said, come back. And he said, okay, sit down now. Let's talk about what you found, what you learned. And I told him what I found. I said, let me go and get papers. He said, no, you've put away your toys. Just tell me. And then I told him, and he said, okay, so you told me what you found. He says, now tell me what you learned. And later when I was in the CRISIL board, I remember saying this to the MD of CRISIL. She was an alumna as well, an amazing person. And she said that she found that particularly thought-provoking, that, you know, this is what you found, what did you learn? So if you took the Mode philosophy further, and Mark came from a different philosophic space and it did different things, but I kept thinking that we have to do more decision orientation, and the only way you can do more decision orientation is to start with decision orientation.
Right. Right.
Because otherwise you're making consulting noises, which is why a lot of people get it wrong in the space between the market researcher and the consultant. And a lot of market researchers and even IT, it's the same thing with the IT business. Clients say, you don't tell me, you're not challenging me. But that whole business model is not Accenture, it's TCS or Infosys or whatever. So you start with spec taking. So you have to do a lot of hard work to get to problem solving and to be the problem solver. And you can't say, therefore, now I'm going to give you advice on what to do, no one's going to take it. You have to build it in so that it falls out of the work that you do. So with that in mind, I was like, and the joke in Marg used to be that if you want to lose certain kinds of projects, send Rama, because by the time she's done with why do you want to know, the clients are so thoroughly pissed off, they'll go and give it to the neighbor. That's exactly what happened. I went up against another large agency that I respect a lot. And we had gone to Italy. It was a scooter client, and they went with all the right things and the details, and I went with let's discuss why you want to do it. And of course, they got the assignment. And then I came back and I hired that guy, and I said, you know, you have to come and work with us. And then I said, no, we have to find a space which is both high on business orientation and high on consumer orientation. So I thought that might be the consulting business, so I went to work in a large consulting company for a while. But I found the consulting company also didn't have the time, and so it was the continuing quest and search for...
So how long did this period last?
Well, I started the research business in 1978. I think I joined the consulting firm in... Well, it lasted until 1999, 2000, when in the search for the space... Again, my teacher, who's the Venerable Indira Parikh, who used to be the Dean of IIM Ahmedabad, she one day heard me out and I was like, these guys aren't doing this and those guys aren't doing that, and I'm looking for the Holy Grail. And she said, if there's a game that only you know how to play, she said, you better go and create your own playground. She said, don't sit and complain. And I thought that was exactly it.
So this was a 15-year
More,
journey.
I would say it was almost, almost 20. But you moved along. I mean, yeah, you saw a little more with every step that you did, and you experimented a little more. You understood yourself a little more. You understood where you came from a little more.
And the market kept approaching the customer as this one single cohort, and you felt, you know, you had...
No, I think the market research industry was focused on researching consumers. The business was focused on business consulting was focused on solving business problems. There was a lot of talk about the customer, but what it takes to do a real consumer-based segmentation study would never justify team costs in any of the big consulting companies, right? And there has to be respect for it on both sides, as well as skills, right? So you have to know how to ask questions. You have to know the difference between did you read the newspaper yesterday versus did you get a chance to read the newspaper yesterday. I mean, they are different questions. Would you like to get fairer versus can you agree or disagree with sometimes I feel that if I were fairer, I could have a wider range of colors, it would do my features better. You know, the skills are in different places. I mean, you have to understand cluster analysis. You have to know, you have to see, it's like my old nanny used to say, and she said in Telugu, the translation roughly is, कि आगे पीछे नहीं मरोगे तो स्मशान का रास्ता पता नहीं चलेगा. So you have to see 10 cluster analyses that are sounding like rubbish the night before the presentation to know that you have to throw out 2 variables for these reasons and the answer will emerge. You have to know what to do when your data is telling you something, you don't know what it's telling you, but it's not telling you what you think it should be telling you. I think often a lot of intuition is also experience.
Right.
It is experience that is analyzed over time when you look at your experience. Like for example, you can show me a set of 50 tables, and at least that's what they used to say in Marg. I don't know if I still have the ability, and I can pick the one number that's wrong. Because I think somewhere it's hardwired. It's the thinking fast and thinking slow that Kahneman talks about. So you do have an instinct. Or for example, you do know that this is where the problem is likely to lie. If you ask me to transform a distribution system and figure out how to change the remuneration structures of distributors, I don't have the gut for it. I will probably screw it up.
Right.
But you do over a period of time, if you analyze and understand what you're hearing and seeing over time, then you're tuned. It's like if you talk to a historian, they're tuned to thinking in time and knowing how analogies work. If you talk to an engineer, they know how to break down the components and put the components back together. I often struggle when I talk to my daughter, who's an economist by training. And she's like, okay, let's assume this for now. And I'm from the physics and the IMA school. And I'm like, I don't want to assume anything. Why should I assume it? And she'll say, can you just assume it for a while? And I'm like, no, my brain doesn't go around it. So I think that is also the purpose of diversity. It is that, if you've studied literature, then you know what great dilemmas are and you know how people solve them. Bring it to the world of business, right?
Right.
If you don't read literature, you don't understand the horns of dilemma. I mean, you should read everything from Madame Bovary to whatever else to understand, to War and Peace, to understand that there is a human condition, there is temptation, this is how people think about it, to have sympathy on all sides, to understand yourself better. And if you don't do that, you don't. And to me, the purpose of diversity is different mind wirings.
Right.
So we all have intuitions in different ways. I mean, when I have a hardcore finance colleague on the board, or I worked with this absolutely amazing man, Mr. Bhide, who used to be a public sector banker. And I've worked with him both on the CRISIL board and the Mahindra Finance board. And he would just say something, look at something, because he'd come with his experience of having seen why SMEs don't perform. And he would know which ones are good ones and which ones are bad ones. So that comes from, I think, a backlog of a lot of experience, which is then analyzed and distilled and is then hardwired into you. And I think if you can tap into that experience that people have, it's absolutely phenomenal. And so I find that public sector people think in a particular way, people in stock markets think in a particular way, historians think in a particular way. And that's actually, to me, the magic of diversity. So that is what intuition is.
Okay. So in the, kind of the culmination of searching the holy grail, as you call it, ma'am, how did the customer-based consumer strategy as a concept come about,
Customer-based business strategy, yeah. So it was looking for that which was high on business direction, business understanding, and high on consumer understanding. And as I told you, my teacher said you have to create your own playground. If there's a game only you know how to play, stop complaining. And that time I had, I think, just turned 40. My father had died. I was working for this big global consulting company. And I decided that I was going to quit. And I was going to do something for myself.
Okay.
And it didn't seem like such a big decision of something for myself. I suspect also I was a bit unemployable after that because by then you have no corporate company experience. I had worked with every single corporate under the sun. The reason I left the global consulting firm also was because I was a bit bored. Because we were doing fact packs on how to convert cigarettes to bidis, fact packs on how Titan came about, fact packs on Nirma. And then one day I sat down and I said, you know what? I have been participating in all these stories. I have been researching all these stories. I have been the market research partner on all these. And why am I now reduced to the drama critic? And I was also getting a little bit bored. It taught me a lot of things I needed to learn, because life is much lifelong learning. It taught me to put money where my marketing mouth was, which is to be able to model stuff into what it means for your P&L.
Right.
It taught me the fundamentals of business strategy in a very, very good way, because that's what they're extremely good at doing. And it taught me the consulting hustle. And so at that time, I also had a conversation with someone, and I was feeling really bad that that meant I did not survive in the corporate world. I didn't do well in the corporate world. So what does walking away from it mean? And again, I met someone, and he said to me that, can you make a list of your role models? No, he also said, is the corporate world for you an umbrella, or is it what did he say, a vehicle? And the difference is that if it's an umbrella, you're terrified to step outside of its shadow, because then you'll get wet or burnt. But if it's a vehicle, if it's not going in your direction, you step off it. And I said, yeah, that makes sense. And then someone else, or maybe he said, can you make a list of your role models and people who inspire you? And I made a list of 3. And I realized that all of them were completely individual.
I mean, is it okay to share?
I can tell you some of them. One was, of course, C.K. Prahlad, who he taught us at IIM Ahmedabad and then went off overseas. But like I said, no, my book came later. But at that time, he was the kind of person who said, if you get down to writing the book, I will write a foreword, just get on with it. He would say, write for your own clarity, don't write for the world, all of which is sound advice.
But and why did you pick him as a role model?
Because I thought single-handedly sitting in a university somewhere, he gave the world the idea of core competence, which transformed thinking. He gave the world the idea of competing for the future, which again transformed thinking. He gave the world the idea of the bottom of the pyramid, fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, like it, don't like it, it again transformed thinking. So how one person, and transformed it worldwide. I mean, every board around the world was talking about these ideas, and that's extraordinary, isn't it? That one person can actually have so much influence on thought. The other was a friend of mine who is a very, very senior politician, and because they're politicians, we don't mention names. But when he was outside of politics, he was a lawyer. When he was inside of politics, he was really famous in running parts of the country. And I remember saying to him, I liked the fact that he could do two things, and he could be, out of power and absolutely frustrated what he did. And I said to him one day that you've achieved everything you want to achieve, so what more keeps you going? And he said, I've never argued in the International Court of Justice, and I'd like to do that. And he mentioned some unfinished business in politics, and he said, I'd like to do that. And again, and that was again interesting. And the third person was the singer Bhimsen Joshi, and I went to his 75th birthday concert, and he said that I say to God that the day I can't sing, take me away. And he sang for himself. He sang for the audience as well. But if Malhar was what came from him, that's what he sang. And then when I put the 3 together, I realized that all 3 were complete individualists who'd had enormous impacts on their world. But they did it without the traditional corporate framework, the backing. I mean, you have some affiliations and you have all those, but it was they that impacted the world, and that was reassuring.
It's surprising you say that, you felt like a failure in the corporate world in those years. Because what you were actually building for yourself was an individual body of work, like many of the mentors that you just mentioned. So, I mean, how did you overcome those the feeling of failure?
The feeling of failure was only because I didn't cut it in the world of business. I didn't become, my classmates were becoming managing directors of this and that, and nobody would hire me as a managing director. Part of the reason of working for small companies in the service business was also the need to balance family and work, right? So if you have a husband in a regular job in a service business, and those were days before emails, before phones, you had to, as long as you were available to your clients when they needed you, they didn't care whether you showed up, whether you took time off to do a birthday party, or whether you were home with a sick parent.
So you made very conscious decisions on career choices,
choosing the smaller. That's
because that
and also, that's right. Partly originally it was, and then after a while you become not capable of doing a 9 to 5. So after I finished my full-time consulting stint at Levers, they said, would you like to stay permanently? And I said, I can't be on call for the chairman at 6 p.m. I mean, it's not happening, right? And I can't get to work at 9 in the morning regularly, and I cannot obey that bunch of rules. I'm not, and after a while you're not cut that way. So your circumstances shape you as well. So then, I mean, I admire my daughter because she is so capable of structured environments. My husband was a great creature of structured environments. Structured environments make me ill. I'm not a creature of structured environments. So you shape yourself accordingly, it shapes you. So,
Yeah, yeah.
And I used to say to people that when you work for yourself, you have to give yourself perks because nobody will. And my perk is beauty parlor 9:30 Monday morning. I mean,
Okay. So when you went back to your alma mater to teach, and you weren't very much older than the professors themselves. So how was it going back and becoming their peers, and how was their entire journey at the
So
campus?
I went back to teach. At that time I was working with Mode. We were the underdog agency. Nobody really, I mean, to even get appointments was hard. You had to really hustle. So I thought if I can teach exec education at IIM Ahmedabad, take a few sessions, then I might get clients. And I was 26, 25. And they said, yeah, it's nice. We'd like to have you teach, but you co-teach with us. There were two professors, one of whom continues to be my mentor, friend, guru, everything, Professor Jain. There's a Professor Vora who's no more, and they used to teach this iconic market research course. And they said, you got to come and teach this. I thought, okay, let's do it. And it was tough going. It was 3 days a week in term time and so on. So one, I think I was not much older than the students, but there's a certain clout you get from controlling CP grades and other grades, so that was okay. But I produced an enormous amount of material for that course from my teaching, so I can see why it was a nice synergy with the course because it brought in the outside experience and so there were a lot of case studies and so on and so forth.
So it became very relevant in a.
So it brought in that to the environment.
Right.
But I have to say that my teachers were just extraordinary because right from day one they offered me peer status. It was Professor Bijapurkar, there's Professor Vora, there was Professor Jain, and they were very helpful. Professor Vora used to call himself Sevakram Unlimited, and I would often go to them and I would say, this case went so badly in class because in 3 minutes they had run circles around me and I didn't know how to take it from there. And then they'd sit down and say, okay, this is what you do, this is what you do, this is what you do. I still teach with Professor Jain. When we teach, we're not teaching that much now, but we taught the customer-based business strategy for over 20 years. And every year we would sit and attend each other's classes, look for new material. In fact, my book Customer in the Boardroom, based on my teaching and consulting, is actually dedicated to him and to my students. So I think it was easy. You have to, I've really not had.
But you traveled from Bombay. You had base here.
I had a base here, and then after a while I had a little baby at home, and you went out on a Thursday morning, early morning flights. You came back on a Saturday evening. You didn't make any money because the payments on that were very small.
But it was passion. It was a passion that kept you going at that point of time.
It was, I think initially it was the hope that you would create business from there. After that, what I admired, what I liked about it is that every year when it was term time, you got to sit down and assess your position on a lot of issues, taking all your years' experience together. So it gave me time to consolidate all the work that I had done in the year and think about it. When the students challenge you, you also read a lot more at that time. So it was a very good, if you like, finishing school for that year, which enriched you and made you stronger in both worlds. So I think the worlds are never porous. Are never siloed. They're very porous.
So after about 20 years of teaching customer-based business strategy, will you acknowledge that today I think there is a cohort of the new CEOs who are thinking of the customer to solve their problems and solve it at scale. The mindset is slowly and steadily changing. Interestingly, in your new book, I think it's the first time that you're talking about the supply side. So far, it's always been from the customer side, consumer side, and how to understand them better. So do you see this dimensional shift happening is one question. And the second part to it is, how did authorship evolve from a...
I would say that if at all, Professor Jain really, and I have had, and other colleagues we've taught with have had impact on we've had hopefully an impact on many generations of CEOs. I mean, I often tell a lot of them who are in very big places today that, I have bragging rights on all you guys. And they're always very kind. So I think in many ways, we hope that we have impacted, we've impacted over time people in some way or the other, the same way I was impacted, right? I was taught by the golden greats, including Dr. Rangarajan and various other people. And I think that there are things that they have told you that stay with you. To your specific question about startups, I think the VCs more than us are doing much more in terms of beating what is the problem you're solving for. Prove to me this is a problem and not a solution in search of a problem. Prove to me that you can do it right. So I think the VC discipline is forcing a lot of people to come at it from the language may be different, but to say, are you solving a real problem? Is it a real need? How much is it going to be worth? And how are you going to solve it? I don't think we've got the scaling piece yet, but I think India abounds with a bunch of pilot tested, market tested, proof of business, beyond proof of concept, very good businesses, and that's changed our world forever. So other people may come and scale better, some of these may die on the wayside, but I think there is a lot of, in fact, a lot of them are what this whole blue ocean strategy that people talk about. I think a lot of our startup community is blue ocean. And it goes below the nose of conventional businesses, it creates new market spaces. But most excitingly, I think the startup world and the digital business models have been able to square the circle of consumers wanting high performance at low prices and the companies wanting profit. And that's why it's such a wonderfully exciting space to be in. And that is my new book. But I write whenever I am fed up enough of the world to want to scream and say, you guys have got it all wrong, listen to me. Sometimes it blows up in your face. But I've always written columns. For about 15 years, I've had an Economic Times column. And the first book came as a result of having participated in innumerable conferences, investor conferences around the world selling India. And the consumer in the boardroom was, customer in the boardroom, I wrote it to say to Professor Jain, I don't want to teach anymore. I'm, done with this. And I just want
the world to know my work, or the world to know our work.
No, I want to encapsulate the work up to here and give it to you, and whoever else wants to teach the damn thing, please take it and go. And it was all very nice, and we continued to teach. And my husband used to say that Guru Dakshina won't end when he dies, it'll end when you die. But I just think that I enjoy working with him.
What's with women and self-deprecation? Sorry, this is completely off the charts, but how can you kind of put everything so casually or carry it so casually on your shoulder?
That's the only way it gets done. Surrendered action. The minute you start saying, the story of the ant on the bull that's pulling the yoke, and if the ant thinks it's doing the work, is really gone. If you believe you're working on it, it is too much of a burden to do. Every time I find that something is getting hard to write, or
hard to communicate or put it.
Then you realize that it's probably because you're so busy focused on how's it going to look, how's it going to be. This is me writing. Will never happen in a month of Sundays. My daughter has a rule that says, are you having fun? And if I say no, she says, imagine how much fun they're going to have reading it. So you have to have fun writing it. You have to do it for yourself. If you believe that it is the larger cause you're doing something in, it will never happen. It will never happen if you say, I am teaching so that all you guys can learn. It's never going to happen. And every time I remember going up to Professor Vora once and saying, you taught me, and he looked at me and he said, I tried to. Or Professor Jain will say that you learn, I teach, and I don't even know how to teach. Or someone says, sir, I have a doubt. He says, so do I have many. So you have to not take it seriously, because it will never get done otherwise.
So beautiful. Yeah, completely.
Right, it is like if you're running a home and a family and parents and cooking and all that, and if you say, I am the central pivot around which this universe works, you're going to die.
Get bogged down in
you're going to die before it even gets off the ground. But if you say, hey, I'm doing the best I can and I will. So what's with women is not the not taking yourself seriously, which I think is a good thing, but is, I think what's wrong with us women is to not be able to say, bhai iske aage mere se nahi hoga.
Drawing the
You
line.
know, to say, drawing boundaries, drawing the line, to say, if I've done so much outside, I deserve my rest inside. We're always trying to accommodate and accommodate and accommodate. But as I tell my daughter, it also makes you a better person, right?
Yeah.
And there's no harm with feeling a little morally superior, even if it upsets enough other people.
Yeah, true.
So you also asked me why, for someone who is so pro-consumer, and the other side of the table, I've talked about supply in this book, in my new book, Lilliput Land. Again, like I said, I write it like I see it. And over time, I'm seeing that we are not, the supply side is, the customer side is way ahead in its desires and action than the supply side. I feel the supply side is not matching up, particularly large supply. Small supply is doing very well. Pani Puri wala on the street versus large food companies. I mean, you can see the big difference, right? So so similarly, the small suppliers, the street is so much more exciting now. So I thought that it was necessary to point that out, because I think consumption also shapes supply. Not all consumption, but there is, no, sorry, all supply shapes consumption. Not all supply. If you import models from America and say, well, this is good supply, world-class supply, nobody wants it. But I think there is enough supply that can stimulate customer demand. So we ourselves have seen that the minute things start becoming available to you that help solve your problems, you end up taking it. I mean, UPI is a great example, right? But it would not have happened had we not had Paytm enrolling every single small vendor. I served on the board of the National Payment Corporation for a long time when it came out, but until somebody took that and seeded the small guys and built the ecosystem, it was an idea with innumerable proofs of concept, right? Similarly, my 94-year-old mother asked me the other day that, do you think the creator of Aadhaar has got the full benefit due to him? And I said to her that, do you give the benefit to the person who dug the well, or the person who created the rope and the pulley to draw water from the well? And so you need that. So I was really pointing out to the crisis on the large supply side and how nobody wanted the mass markets. The big companies didn't want them. The Indian companies, the multinationals didn't want them. And that fits into your question on the startup economy, because I think not only do they have the model to square the circle of price performance for the customer and profit for the company, but they also are doing a lot of blue oceans which are solving problems. So that's why I thought the supply side needed to be talked about in the context of how do you understand consumption in India.
Right. So now we move into, what I'd like to talk about as you as an independent director. I think you worked on multiple large blue chip companies, and really large. I mean, when we talk of game changers in the Indian industry, literally. So which one was your first board appointment? How did that come about?
That was actually Infosys, believe it or not.
Oh, wow.
No, there was a little bit before that. There was a Stand Chart board where they just called me, and it was not even I don't think it was a statutory board at that time. I think they were just a branch office of the parent company. And then there was, I think there was one
You were a business consultant in your professional space.
So I used to write, I used to write a lot, right? So I think that's where the visibility came from. So it was just, on the one hand, I think the power of writing a lot and scattering your mouth around. And the second was, I think, also just the largeness of Murthy and company, that they were willing to, and at that time it was not even statutorily required to have a woman, but they were willing to have someone there because they liked what I said. And so he called me and he said, I was 40 years old, I just quit my earlier job, or maybe 41, 42, I don't know. And then he called me and he said that, would you mind if we put your name up to the nomination committee? And we don't have any guarantee that you will actually get it. But I want you to know that we have a lot of affection and respect for you either way. So I said, fine. And that was actually the first board,
Wow. Okay. Today, in multiple places, there are 2 women directors. There's a statutory regulation and all of that. But at your time, was it a lone women voice many times?
A lot. And even now in a lot of boards, it is the lone voice.
And is it ever gendered in your perspective, or it's equal play?
No, it's definitely gendered in many, many, many ways across the board. In different ways. I mean, like for example, the very fact that there's a mushrooming industry to train women directors. I'm saying, where was the mushrooming industry to train men directors? Why did it mushroom the minute women came? Every time people come to me and say, can you do this session for training women directors? And all the golden greats are consulting firms are jumping into it to train women directors. And I'm like, please get chairman of companies together and I will tell them how to run an inclusive board, because we do participate in different ways. You know, it's the dynamics of it that's different. And please get NRC chairman together or chairpersons together. Firstly, you know, can we not say chairman, can we say chairperson? Let's get the NRC chairpersons together and let's solve this problem of where are the women, because you want the 5 designer women who, you know, you need to come on all the boards. That doesn't work. But so that's an example of gender. I mean, need one say more? I mean, and of course there are dynamics. There are people who also, if you are not in the, if you don't play the game the way the men do in terms of dynamics in any boardroom or a large meeting or whatever, there's enough written about this for it not to be a special experience. And if you don't do that, and if you don't want sharp elbows, and if you only speak, if you feel everybody's already said what there is to be said and you don't want to repeat everything that's all over again, which sometimes the men do, because that is their product of their conditioning and training, then you could go for many long board meetings with being silent. So I think you have to find your own way of saying your own stuff.
Navigating
so
it.
over a period of time, I think you do. I mean, I used to joke that I never knew I was not a member of the boys' club until I was admitted into the boys' club, and then you say, oh, is that how you support each other? But so yeah, it's this women directors thing, for example, you know.
Glad to know you were admitted into the boys' club.
Right, but and also I think a lot of, actually I have to say that after I joined boards, there have been board members who have tutored me, mentored me. I mean, there is this. I remember I was on the Titan board with Ishat Hussain, and I didn't understand very much accounting of what was required at that time, given what was going on in that company. And I remember making notes of everything that they discussed in the audit committee meeting. And then on the flight back, I would sit next to him and I would say, okay, now explain to me, these are the 5 things I didn't understand. And he would patiently sit and understand it. Or Mr. Bhide, who I talked to you about, would, or when I first joined the CRISIL board, okay, I remember Ravi Mohan came to me and said, do you know what a rating agency does? And I said, no. And he said, okay, fine, you're perfect, join the board. And it had all the golden greats there. I mean, there was the chairman of UTI, there was the world's Forex leader, there was Mr. Bhide, there was Mr. Bhave, who was, not Mr. Bhave, there was Mr. Bhargava. These were all like the golden greats of the banking world. And they would actually stop meetings and say, Rama, have you understood? And if I said no, they would explain it to me there. That's a kind of mentoring. So, you know, it's like when you stand in front of your bookshelf and you realize that your thinking is a product of all these zillions of things you've read. It's the same way when you sit back, you find that there is, it's a product of all these people who mentored you. And those days they did that. And this is before the statutory, before anything else. And before you, and there were people who would be on standby for me if I said that if there was a vote coming up and I don't know how to do this, you know, will you explain this to me so that I know that I am voting in the right direction? And there would be people who would give me that kind of support.
I'm going to digress a little here because, you know, you bring such a valid point on admitting or not knowing. You know, many times I think there is a shyness around that. And I find that a common streak amongst most successful people or people who've navigated from the long term is that you acknowledge what you know, you acknowledge what you don't know, and you're willing to learn at all points of time. Can you just briefly, you know, you've spoken so beautifully about it, and you know that's what I've imbibed. Is there anything else you want to add on that?
So for a long time, you don't have to admit in a public meeting that you don't know, because that is awkward. I take that. I mean, you know, unless people are gracious enough, which I was glad enough to do, and I was glad enough to have. But for a long time, I used to call up 1 or 2 or 3 colleagues and tell them that, you know, this is what I actually want to say, this is what I actually think. I would send them text messages and I would say, this is what I feel. So there was a lot of off-board work. And one of them said, why don't you say it? You know, I'm getting all the credit for saying all the things you are telling me. But at that time, I felt that I did not have the confidence to say it. I did not know that I was doing it. The atmosphere was not congenial enough for me to say it at that time. At that time, I was also younger and less confident, maybe. about stuff that I didn't quite know about. So then there are many ways of doing it, right? Sometimes you called up people and said, this is what I think, but this is where the direction it is going. And how do I reconcile the two? And on every count, in fact, the day before yesterday, I called up my friend who I went to school with. Her name is Vinita Bali, and she's famous. So I called up Vinita and I said, hey, Vinita, okay, help me clarify my mind around this. You know, this is what I'm seeing in the corporate results. This is what I'm not seeing. How do I think about it? And we have many interesting chats on many issues, and we think that, oh God, we should do a podcast on the stuff we talk to each other about.
Yeah.
But it is about a knowledge network of people who are willing to learn and contribute. I've had a range of economics tutors. I do not fully understand economics. I've never studied it. I've learned it after liberalization, right? Till then, you didn't really need to know.
Yeah.
But even the late Bibek Debroya would send him a text message and I would say this, and I'm thinking this, and what do you think that? And they would actually, sit and talk to you about it. And that is true for many people. There's, Dr. Rakesh Mohan, who would sit in my office and scribble on the back of a napkin. He would draw his charts, and so there are all these people. And my daughter sometimes asks me that, what do you need to do to get these people to mentor you? I mean, Dr. Ashok Ganguly used to be the chairman of Levers. When I used to sit and describe board situations to him and wonder whether I was in the right or the wrong, without naming names, obviously, he would give me guidance because he was more experienced. And she says, what do you need to do to get mentored? And I was thinking and I was saying, and now that I do mentor, I don't mentor as in to mentor, but I have a lot of people who come and go. I think part of it is that the people who are mentoring you are also thinking along with you. So it's not like they know it all and you know nothing. But when you ask the question, when you frame a point of view, when you put something, it challenges them to think a little more. And I think it's win-win on both sides, right? So you learn something, they learn something. Sometimes you're providing a window to a world that they may not be seeing anymore. I mean, I don't see a window to a lot of worlds anymore. But when someone comes and tells me about it, that's a cup of tea and, fact-free advice dispensed. But you get to see the world through their eyes. And so there are any number of reasons. And sometimes people do it because they empathize with the way they used to be in your predicament now and they want to help. And sometimes they do it because they're just genuinely nice people who believe that Saraswati is meant to be shared and not hoarded. And there are enough of those in the world if only you will find them.
Right. And seek out?
I think if you are in seek mode, you will find. If you are in seek mode, you will find them. I mean, whenever I go to give a talk somewhere, the temptation is to run back after that and have a cup of coffee. But if there's someone after that who's interesting, then you reach. So to your seek out, it is fair. Today I have a lot of peer tutors, mentors, people who are younger than I am, which is literally the whole world at the moment. But what I actually do is I'm texting everybody all the time and saying, you said this yesterday, I heard your session, but I understand this, and can I call you for 5 minutes to ask you this question? So I do a lot of that. My husband used to say that I would be the first consultant who would get paid to stop offering unasked for advice, and he said that's a good revenue model for you. And I used to do a lot of that. I would write to people constantly and say, but you should be doing this, and why aren't you doing this? So you are in a
intellectual hustle that's going on, and you read, and you're not stopping with it being within you. So you're doing that extra bit of
if I find something,
and everybody likes to be heard. I mean,
sure. Or if you're doing something, if you read something interesting, I still send it to Professor Jain, or I say, I heard this in a meeting yesterday. I think our time has come, but we didn't do well the last time. So, what happened to us? Which material do we need to change? Or any number of these things. Or sometimes you call a young CEO and you say, I completely disagree with the statement you made, though I think you did a fabulous job on that. So, they have to take the pain of dealing with you if they want to. So,
a privilege, I think, in most
I hope so.
So I'm going to touch upon 3 strategy aspects, could be linked to your board experience also. One is, like I mentioned earlier, that you had this opportunity to be as part of the strategy team that kind of worked on your advice. We did some fabulous work. We did focus group discussions, understood the customer, spent time with them, and came up with a very detailed customer-oriented strategy. But at that point of time, what was failing was the operational effectiveness or the efficiency of the company. So many of this didn't see light of day, even though it was, I would think, good work and a need of the hour at that point of time, and a lot of things. How many of these companies fail because of lack of business strategy, and how many because of operational effectiveness?
I think the two are linked. This is what they call the tyranny of or, profit or consumer, employee or customer, ops or strategy. If you are running away spinning wheels with operational effectiveness, but you're missing out whole strategic opportunities, it's not much use to you. Similarly, if you have great strategies that you are unable to operationalize and execute, or which require a total change in your DNA or your processes, which you are not able to do, won't happen. So instead of or, positioning it as or, if you look at, as we often teach a business as a value delivery system, choose what value you're offering to whom in the world, organize to deliver that value, and signal the value. You have to get all three pieces together. So I think very often companies, or sometimes companies, are not ready for that world. And it also appears, if then to attempt a segmented play where you have to have multiple value delivery systems for multiple customers, isn't working. So I also think that top teams need to have respect for this. As I often say, customer centricity is not, like you sprinkle attar on something, is not that. Because if you're doing a sprinkler of something on something, it won't work. The mental picture of customer centricity is, if you have, let's say, a patient with an IV going through, into the IV drip we put many medicines.
Yeah.
So you have to put it right into that drip, which is really where customer-based business strategy came from. That is not about implementing the strategy, but it's about embedding the customer into your business strategy altogether. So I think for very many reasons at the top, I know that top management doesn't have the respect for it because they feel they can do without it. And I say, okay, wait till competition hits and then we'll see. Very often the answer to a competitive scenario is not to think about delivering better customer value, but to acquire a competitor. And I'm saying, fair enough, that's a way to play. But where it does come together, it does come together. And if you can't execute a strategy, or if you have relentless execution with no strategy, they're both just as bad. It will blow up in your face at some point in time.
Yeah.
If I'm sitting on a board and I find that the stated strategy and all the operational plans are completely divergent, I say to them that, guys, either change this or change that. I don't care which one you change. Change your aspirations, change your strategy, and say, I'm going to do this with operations. Or if I see an incentive plan that is based on operational performance excellence for the CEO, I will ask the question and say, that can we not have, that does the person get rewarded if he's missed a whole new opportunity that somebody else saw and went for, but he's done this pond perfectly, he's swum perfectly in this pond, but he's missed a whole other pond to fish in, to mix metaphors, will you reward? So I think these are the kinds of conversations we have when it comes to governance. Yes.
Understood. So, when you think of it at many parts, and putting them all together, sometimes you feel that companies that succeed has universe conspiring, very simply put, has an overlaying reason why things come together and fall into place. And I love the example you gave on, toilet cleaners and cleaning disinfectants. It had 3 layers of rural women getting more educated, the urban women getting more busy. And things like that falling into place. So the demand creates, there's somebody who wants to create the supply and bring it together. So, so how does one, if it is going to mean that a company exists only if it is meant to exist, how do you kind of put it together in a layman concept?
Let me try and answer that. I don't know that I have an elegant answer to that. But I would say that firstly, if you are If you are going against the grain of what consumers need, not what they say they want, but what you believe they need. For example, today, if you are looking at a more polluted world, we all need to get healthier. Rich and poor are noticing it. If you go on Marine Drive or Worli or anywhere else, you see the kind of people who are going for morning walks and so on and so forth. And we know that that is a trend. We also know that people are giving their children less chocolates, less chips. You're young, you had coffee, tea without sugar, I notice, and so on and so forth. So there is a certain grain. Now, in the face of that, if you want to push something that is a regular use, gooey, bad for you, wonderful for your spirits, terrible for your health kind of products, then you have to know that you can't do it, right?
Right.
So I think one part of it is to be able to have enough sensing to know whether you're going against the grain of the consumer, whether you have headwinds or tailwinds. People sometimes say that people are ahead of their times, which is also true. Now, that is true of people, it is true of companies, that sometimes you make the wrong call on the readiness of the world to accept what you have to offer. People often tell me market research failed. Every time I read about Steve Jobs, I realize that what he has done is understood the fundamental need and delivered it in so many more elegant ways.
True.
Which is why it's not about making customers your marketing director. It is about fundamentally understanding needs. What is it that drives
The emerging
people?
trends, going back
What
to
is the
Professor
fundamental needs of society? I mean, what is, there's an anthropological view, there's a psychological view. We know young people are getting really, really hassled. As you can see, the increase in therapists and coaches and wellness consultants and so on and so forth. So there are things that are happening in the world that you have to understand and know because your business is located there. Right? So that's not chancy. You can call it wrong, but it's not that the world has to conspire for you. You have to be tuned to the world. So are you in tune or are you not in tune? Sometimes you can be out of tune, and it is possible to be out of tune if you're a pioneer. I mean, look at the number of people who died on Arctic expeditions before you had one that made it. Look at the number of failed attempts to get to the moon. So that's a whole different conversation, right?
Right.
But I think so that is true. Sometimes companies are in exactly the right place and the right time, and you've hung around long enough, and COVID hit, and it's absolutely perfect, and you have the ideal. We don't actually. Every low-income kid, it really upsets me that they all had to go online, and there was only one cell phone in the household, and which sister used it.
True.
And where were all these guys who could do very simple screens without multiple formulations, and why was that not hitting the market? But anyway, that said, time came for telecom.
Time came for digital. Somebody told me, COVID was our chief digital officer.
Yeah, was the chief digital officer. COVID forced you to experiment with a lot of things, and that's what actually happened to us. And but if you called it wrong, and if you said, as people said, that, the world is going to want healthier things and going to become a kinder place after COVID, I was saying that even in the gap between the two, people were running and eating pani puri on the street. So where are you doing this? Right? So I think some of it is sensing, some of it is the rap of the pioneer, some of it is not sensing. And of course, all of us know in life as well as companies, you need a large dollop of luck. I mean, if at that point in time COVID happened and you were a lender and you were an unsecured lender, I mean, you took NPAs. I mean, shit happens.
So, keeping the conspiring aside, I think, we just need to keep going back, understanding the consumer dynamic, the business trends.
Your ability to supply, your ability to deliver value as compared to the next guy, because that's what the game is all about, right?
Yeah. And keep knowing to deliver it at scale as well.
Yeah.
Understood. One last point before we move on is, again, I feel, a lot of the startups have done recently well, solved for a lot of problems in the recent time. But there are two things that kind of come in the way in somewhere in their journey in comparison to some of the older corporates that have existed. One is, I think it's your favorite, the value versus valuation concept that I would like to hear from you. And the other one you very briefly touch upon here and there is humility. And I find that quite fascinating because I think humility is quite underrated in this space, because when you hit a midway mark, you think you've achieved what you have to achieve, or your idea has become a path-breaking one. So, how does one balance these two concepts? One is not getting carried away. I think greed, if we have to just put it in human emotion, it's greed. And the other is retaining humility.
It will happen if you take away the opposition, and I always think whenever someone presents me with an opposition, I check whether that opposition is really an opposition. Similarly, personally, if someone tells me you can either do this or that, my first thought is why can't I do both and how do I get both? So that's, I think, good greed because it forces you to innovate.
And are we going in that direction increasingly? Do you see?
I think the value versus valuation is a real one where I'm saying that the dharma of business is to add value to the customer as the customer perceives it and extract value. I mean, another guru god who I met only once in my life, Kenichi Omai, he says in a brilliant article in the Harvard Business Review, which we give as day one reading for our course, he says the heart of strategy is not about beating the competitor, but about adding value to the consumer and avoiding the competitive battle altogether. And he has many, many examples of how the Yamaha keyboard was born and nutraceuticals and this, that and the other. So I think the value to the consumer is the basic dharma of business, and if you are trying to get eyeballs quick, get sales quick, declare victory quick so that I can have valuation, then to me that's if there are people who are willing to support you, well and good, that's fine. But to me, that is saying that I want instant karma. I don't want to work for it. Or people tell me, a lot of startups and new companies tell me that they have brands. And I'm thinking KitKat is a 100-year-old brand and still going strong. And what you have is a recognized trademark or a label, but does it fulfill all the qualities of a brand? And that's a whole different branding discussion. And many of them don't fall muster, right? Many brands are not really brands. So to me, that's also the humility thing is, are you smoking your own dope?
Right.
By all means, hustle valuation. But tell yourself in your heart of hearts that this is a very narrow window where I don't really have consumer value, but I'm going to shove this valuation thing as hard as it will go, then do it. Your customer is your valuator, and if they can't figure it out, bad luck, that's okay. But the minute you believe that your valuation tells you that I'm driving customer value, then you are smoking dope. So you must know who you are. It goes back to fundamental self-awareness of people as well as companies, right? I mean, I often ask people, what is your core incompetence? I mean, I know my core incompetence is my eyes glaze over when it gets to the nuts and bolts of the details. I believe that I can execute things that I want to very well, but I don't really want to get into the planning. I also know that I'm better at tasks than carrying people along. So if you know that that's what you do, then put yourselves in environments where that works. So humility to me is actually the flip side. So value arrogance I talk about, which I think a lot of multinationals have, which means that you don't grant your local competitor the value that the local competitor is delivering to the customer, and you believe that you have it all because you come from somewhere else. That's value arrogance. So it's the same thing that if you have value arrogance, then you don't have humility, right? I mean, it's the flip side of those books that say only the paranoid survive. You have to be paranoid all the time about whether you are delivering incremental customer perceived value or you're not delivering incremental customer perceived value.
Right, right.
And if halfway through, in the interest of valuation, you are moving to adjacent spaces and other spaces and other spaces, then be honest enough to tell yourself the truth that says it's heavy going here. So I'm moving to the next pond and the next pond, the next location, the next pin code so that I can get my sales numbers up. But don't tell yourself that this is strategy. So I'm saying I'm all for spinning whatever party lines will work for whoever, wherever. But inside you must know
what the truth
is. And to me, that is the humility or the paranoia or the whatever. It's not, humility is not about saying, hum nachis hai, I'm not anything. You got a good thing going, you got a good thing going. But it is just honesty, it's integrity to yourself so that it protects you, which is what I tell a lot of CEOs, that don't rail against a strong board because they are your best protection. They will save you from yourself because you quite rightly will get carried away and go down a path. And as Dr. Ganguly, the former chairman of Levers, a venerable board member said, he said that I had a board, I think that's what he said when he was talking about his new book, where they said, you do whatever you want to do, go gangbusters in full throttle, full flow, let your full personality go through. We will make sure that, you're not screwing up big time. Now, isn't that fabulous?
Amazing, amazing.
So that's not either or, a CEO, empowered CEO versus a board. That's another example of an opposition that isn't really an opposition. They tell you that in spirituality as well, right? That if you examine the opposition, it goes away. So it allows me to flower completely. secure in the knowledge that somebody else is going to save me from myself and my stupidity, or challenge me enough for me to think about it. So very early on in when I was doing We Are Like That Only, I had a very young editor called Chapal Mehra. And I was getting very upset with the overseas editor who kept making very nasty comments in the book. And I said to him that he doesn't understand India. And he said to me that if someone is saying what you're doing is not making sense, he said, don't answer his question and try and neutralize him. He said, take it as an invitation to write it differently so that it expands it better.
Oh, beautiful.
And I think that's really what the game's all about.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that was very, very enlightening. I mean, it gives a very nice
That was a lecture
perspective.
that very few people listen to.
No, but it was fabulous. Getting it straight on. So one other thing which I think, I notice even in your career span is there is, we see the very fancy side of it to the outside world. And, only after I started speaking to you or, even whatever company you take, only when you get into it, behind all the fanciness is simply work, eat, repeat. There is this monotonous, boring stuff that you need to keep doing. And you said, incremental value adds happen over the period of time and something very beautiful emerges eventually. With the young crop, I also see, something like an entrepreneurial fatigue, that kind of sets in. Like you could do what you were doing for, say, 30, 35 years at a stretch and keep reinventing yourself at various points of time. So, forget entrepreneurial fatigue. I think, career fatigue, name it whatever. There is a sense of fatigue that sets in much earlier. So what do you think?
So I think the world today is perhaps a little more demanding. I think the world always was demanding, but maybe we weren't switched on 24/7. But no, that's not true. I remember when my daughter was small, going back to work at 9 at night so I could work till midnight.
Yeah, I think that's how
so my
it was
secretary
even in
can
the
type
bank.
in the morning, and so that's the way it was. But I think fatigue comes in two reasons. One, when you're going back to your operational excellence versus strategy. If you don't know where you're going, and that is the problem with the gig world, I will do this or that or that or that or that or that. I mean, just the fatigue of not having a beacon, not having a direction, not having navigating principles. You don't have to know your destination. The new strategic theory also is about having navigational principles. So if you don't know yourself, you don't know your navigational principles, you want to do as well as the next person. I mean, we used to tell our daughter when she was much younger that by all means go and be a public policy economist, but please let's not have a meltdown if your best friend is an investment banker who's doing fabulously well and has got a yacht by the time she's 30. I mean, whatever choices you make, you live with them. But fatigue comes, I think, sometimes from the direction. It is a very fatiguing world. Also, I think and I'm going to be very unpopular for saying this, but I also think that there are times, I mean, the idea of grihastha and the idea of vanaprastha is is there for a reason. So very often when your career goes into a plateau, that's the time when you have your children to manage. If you choose to have children, that's the time you have the older members of your family to take care of. You're taking care of parents, you're cremating parents, you're tending to your marriage, you're building social capital. There's grihastha happening.
Yeah.
So that automatically sort of takes the focus away, and sometimes you're actually quite happy your career is plateauing because you can do all this other stuff that you need to do. You need to, go and attend dance classes so that the brat will go to dance class. You need to be able to show up for Diwali at family events. So sometimes I think if you look at life as a total balance, then it balances out.
So you don't need to worry about, a plateau or a temporary
No,
fatigue.
if you have a full-blown grihastha, the grihastha will take care of itself. It's like a portfolio that balances itself because at the time, in your 40s typically or later, you have things, and then there's always somebody's career is up in the household, somebody's is down. You have to radiate positive energy on one count. Other people have a bit of a plateau. So I think in one way that takes care of itself. Second is that if you set unrealistic goals that says I'm going to retire by the time I'm 35, I'm 40, I think goal-based thinking sometimes, I prefer navigational principles to goal-based, which is what are the principles that enable me to go forward. So for example, in my work, I'm very clear it's impact more than money. I had a very good friend whose board I was on for a while who said to me, why is your bank balance bigger than your why is your reputation bigger than your bank balance? And I said to him that perhaps because I've managed one more carefully than I've managed the other. But if you have principles that say this, then I think it helps navigate things better. And you have fatigue, but reinventing is to take care of fatigue, right?
Yeah.
So if you say, I want to be able to do exactly what I'm going to be able to do without any nod to the environment, then you are going to be fatigued because you are going against the grain and against the flow. It is true for companies as well as for all of us.
True.
Right? Similarly, now I'm very conscious when people say what's happening and I say I'm going to Vanaprastha and they think it's a joke, but it's actually not, because there has to be an orderly transition of generations. I don't want to do a lot of stuff that I used to do earlier. I want to be able to wake up at 8:30. I want to be able to have my nap in the afternoon. I want to enjoy my houses. It is one of my major sorrows that my husband passed away without enjoying his the fruits of the heavy lifting of life, which is both grihastha and or its equivalent in the career sense as well, and that he never got to see what a lovely person his daughters become, or he never got to enjoy his homes or his money. So I'm quite clear then that I don't want that to happen to me. So to me, that's a navigational principle again. So I think reinventing is part of re-energizing. If you take life seriously, it is exhausting. You have to kind of learn to go with the flow. And I think navigational principles over end goals.
Over end goals. Re-energizing, and not taking yourself seriously. And sometimes allowing it to plateau and, taking
having a portfolio of life, right?
Holistic. So, ma'am, I had this question on, I've always found you to say what you feel. You say it as you see it. And it fascinates me, honestly, because I think a lot of women carry both insight, competence, and there is a brutal honesty in most parts of the interaction, a lot of it. And you're almost like a pioneer, a beacon for all of us in that space. So has it been very challenging to carry this personality, A? And should we learn to sugarcoat more in the corporate world?
Yes to both. Yes, I wouldn't say sugarcoating, but I would say to be able to say it compellingly. I think this assertion, aggression has always been an issue with me. That how can I be assertive without being aggressive? And I put this down to the fact that all of us have had to be very aggressive in order to go through all our burdens in life, right? From your childhood onwards later. If you weren't a fighter, there are so many occasions in life when you would just give up, more so for women.
Yeah.
So I think being assertive without being aggressive, making your point very sharply, but in a way that is, as Narayan Murthy used to say, can you disagree without being disagreeable? Now, what is disagreeable is a moot point. One man's disagreeable is not another person's disagreeable, one woman's disagreeable. Right. But I think there is something there to learning how to deliver messages, which is good for men as well as for women. More so for women, because I think that with all the gender stereotyping, it isn't taken as well, right? When I say,
the moment there's a little bit of aggression, I think there is a backlash, a little bit of it.
But I think
it's improving.
Over time, people get used to it. So I used to have a boss one day who said to me very early in my career, he said, why do you have so many chips on your shoulder? And I still remember the answer I gave him then, and today I cringe when I think of the answer. And he said, when will you get rid of the chips? And I said, no, I'm not going to get rid of the chips. I'm just going to wait till I'm rich and famous and have diamond chips that are polished. So everybody will say, wow, I like those chips on your shoulder. And he just looked at me disgustedly and left. And I was really angry with him that day. And that was the end of that story. But later I realized that I've placed myself in a particular brand positioning, for lack of a better word, I guess, or in an environment where the honesty of what you have to say is what you get paid for. Now, would
And
I have survived as
deeply
CEO of
admire
any
you
place?
for
I
it.
probably wouldn't have. I mean, so there are lots of places where you can't take this personality and go.
Yeah,
You cannot.
true.
I used to have a client who used to say, okay, you do you, and I will follow with an ambulance and a stretcher. Okay, it's an ouch moment, but what he meant was that, okay, I don't want to stop you, but I will need to follow with an ambulance and a stretcher. So I think you have to be aware that that's
Where
the
you
way it
are
is.
and what liberties you have and
Yeah.
what plays to your.
Which is why I sometimes joke with my daughter and say, I can say anything I can say to you because I raised you and you calibrate me. But I don't know that I can do exactly the same until I get to know your partner, your significant other better, who you at that time I was telling whoever you bring home, because I've not raised the person, he doesn't calibrate me, and it could just end up blowing up in my face.
Right.
So you have to be careful. Yeah, it's not the best way to be. I wish I had a.
But I wish to
had a
place on
different-
record that I have a deep admiration for that trait you carry, ma'am. So,
yeah, I wish I could have not sugarcoated it, but I wish I could have made it a lot more palatable in a lot of the earlier years as well. I wish. But as you grow older, the world gets used to you. Though I have a poster in my study which has elephant with huge butterfly ears, and it says, "Be yourself, the world will adjust."
yeah.
And
that's
I give
one of my
that
favorite
to I
quotes.
give that to all the young women I know, and I'm saying, just be yourself.
It was my DP for a long time.
It was your DP for a long time, lovely. Yeah, so I think it's a little bit of both. You have to
Yeah.
push the world a little bit, you have to accommodate the world a little bit, but you have to, you have to learn to say it politely and pleasantly.
How did home cope with you?
Home?
With the very busy-minded, hustling.
Oh, I think we had a lot of laughs. I think my husband was the opposite. I think he was steady, more reticent, quieter. He had a very, very bright mind. So, in fact, people asked me for a long time, why did you not write? And I said, as long as he was there, I would tell him an idea. First, you had to hold a shotgun and make him listen to you, because mostly they ignored me. The joke at home used to be, if Mama didn't show up, it would take us, if Mama got lost, it would take us a week to notice her absence. So there would be lots of that kind of exasperated joking. But if you gave him an idea that was a bit oddball, he was classically trained, and he would tell you exactly 10 ways in which it was incorrect. And I would go and manage those 10 ways, and you would come up with a new theory that skated past people. It was not obvious where the flaws were. So once he died, I found that I didn't have that. And then, by yourself, then you realize that you don't have. So in fact, that's when later I started leaning on Aparna a little bit. So in my latest book also, I tell her that that the mantle, my second book, I dedicated to my most insightful in-house consultant. And the latest one I dedicated to her, and I said that Dad would have been both relieved and delighted that you had taken over. So I think in homes everybody gains from each other. So you gain from the stability and the taciturness. I think we divided up the world well. We had traditional gender roles. I don't think he ever got himself a glass of water in the kitchen.
Okay.
Or maybe he did. I don't know. It's not fair to say that because he's not here. But I realized after he died that I had never changed a gas cylinder in my life. So obviously he did do a lot of stuff. I had never bought a car. I never changed a gas cylinder. I never renovated a house. And I was thinking, how did all this stuff get done?
I call Pradeep head of admin.
Exactly.
So he's the
When I sold the car that we had, they said, so give us a duplicate key, and I didn't know cars came with duplicate keys. And Aparna, my daughter, said to me, just look in Dad's cupboard, might find it. So I opened his cupboard. I opened out a drawer, and sure enough, in the original envelope, it was duplicate keys of car, and there was another envelope which had duplicates of every single certificate of mine because I had none. So I think home copes, I think there's always exasperation, ups and downs. We had a mad dog before this one who bit everybody in sight, and he had shared a birthday with me, and he was really bright. And Ashok used to say that like some other people in this house, he has more brains than good sense. So we went through a lot of that, but I think we
carried it with humor.
I think we carried it with a lot of humor, and in fact I raised a toast to him the day before Aparna's wedding. Nice. And we were quite wicked in some counts, but I think we carried it with humor. I think with respect, for I mean, my only advice to my daughter was marry a gender liberal, because I think that his younger brother also married a banker who's no more. But I said that, you know, the men in this family have all been gender liberals, which is why we are the way we are. So a gender liberal is not, it's not that it doesn't say, hey, come on, have you seen the quality of food in this house? What have you been doing? That's not the absence of gender liberality. But the absence of it is, the gender liberal is not saying, भाई आयम जाके पढ़ाने की क्या जरूरत है?
I know.
You
I know
know,
exactly
या
what you mean.
और करने की क्या जरूरत? You
और
know what
करने
it is, right?
yeah.
So I think that we don't need support as much as we need gender liberality, when nobody's limiting you because
That's
of
a
your
beautiful
gender.
word.
And when they have more faith in you than you have in yourself, because hey, get on with it, it's okay, then it's fine.
That's another thing I've found very fascinating. You know, there where the husband or the companion has more faith in you than
Yeah.
you realize it yourself.
Yeah, and that is what.
And I find it a common thread among a lot of achieving. I mean, I don't know if I should color it that way, but
No, I think it is someone who has your back, who believes in you, who believes that you can cut it, and so in your moments of down. And I'm sure it's a favor returned as well, because I mean the men as well go through crisis of
true.
confidence, and to say, except that they probably disclose it, we probably have a lot more crises of confidence. I mean, I know friends.
And we talk about it a lot more.
Yeah, and I know friends who, after they've had their babies, didn't want to go back to work, and their husbands literally had to boot them out of the house and say, go, you know, the kid will be okay. Yeah, I used to leave every day from home and say, look after when I went out on tour, and say, take care of my baby for me. I came back, the baby would be happy. If he went out clubbing, she would go clubbing, and she would eat pasta and, not pasta, pizza, and drink Coke and eat chips and be delighted that mom was away. So I think, yeah, home copes.
Ma'am, I don't know if I can tread into this path, but when the loss happened, how did you face it? How did you cope with it?
Oh, it was devastating, yeah. Yeah, I think yeah, and also you must realize that I've been married at 20, right? So I didn't really know life. So every year on my birthday, particularly later, I would count up the percentage of time I'd spent with him versus my parent. And I would say you can't complain if you don't like what you see, because buddy, I mean, you know, it's partly your fault. So yeah, it was very, very hard. I did fall apart, I think, quite significantly, but you just have to get up and keep going. And as they say, you don't move on, but you move forward.
You hold on to...
You move forward, you have to restructure your life, you feel really lousy for a while. But, you know, the first couple of years is always a readjustment. A household run for two has to be run for one. You have your child or children to settle in whatever form. And once all that happens, then you sit down and you process it. Yeah, you miss the joking, you miss the companionship. When people say to me that, oh, why don't you come to our house for dinner? I say to them that you have no idea how joyful it is for me to see a dining table full of people. You know, or why do you go overboard when people come over? I'm like, even my household is excited that we have people. So yeah, I don't love it, but I don't love it. No, it's okay. I don't love it, but it is the way it is.
Yeah, true. So today, and you know, whatever it was in the earlier years, what's your daily mantra? What has kept you together in terms of spirituality, in terms of hobbies, passions?
Yeah, I think whenever I remember once another chairman of Leavers, he asked me, I was getting really head up about something, and he said, why don't you take a break? He said, do you have hobbies? And I just looked at him and I said, you know, when you tramp all over Crawford Market on a Sunday trying to buy lace because the maid who's learning stitching has to make the birthday dress for your child and all that, I said, I don't think you need any more hobbies. You just need a break from life. So that's what I do. I'm generally very good with myself by myself. I am a Devi Upasika. I come from a place of knowing that she has showered everything on me more than I mean, the idea of deserve actually is a non-idea. But she has showered everything that I have on me, and I'm grateful and I value that. And that core keeps me going. I had a teacher in my roughest years. He used to live up the road. He was an Advaita teacher, and I learned some stuff from him. Some stuff you learn from other people and friends. As you know, I live opposite the Mahalakshmi Mandir. I just love it. I hear the aarti every day at 7:30 in the evening. Tells me all's well with the world, and I think that core also helps you feel that somebody else is in charge of your life and it's okay. And it also helps you look at the world and know that you don't control anything. After my husband died, I did think about it, and I found that there were young people dying, older people dying. It was the cycle of life. And the hardest part, for example, of coping with the loss is not the not missing, but to understand or accept the cycle of life. I don't know that we fully understand it.
I absolutely get it.
But if you accept that there is a cycle of life, then it just makes life easier. So, also my teacher used to say to me that when you're home, you don't have to keep reciting the address of your house in order to remember it. You know you're home. So I have no religious ritual. I know if she wants to see me, she will call me. Somebody will come over and say, hey, let's go to the temple. Sometimes the aarti is loud and clear. Sometimes my birthday this time I took a bunch of my, not a bunch, 3 or 4 of my women friends, my cousin to Sringeri, and we had a
we follow
fabulous,
the
we do. We had a fabulous Sharda Devi darshan. And so that helps you feel that all's well with the world and a certain amount of energy. So that's continuously evolving. I wish I had a guru, but they say the guru will come when the pupil is ready. I had one for a while. I used to think, oh gosh, I wish I had someone who was, more liberal, not hidebound gender rules, and spoke English. And here was this man, he used to be a banker, and then afterwards he sort of
moved into
he moved into this and all that. So he used to tell me that I can see the PowerPoint chart in your head. If A happens, put an arrow, B will happen, put an arrow, C and D. And he said, can you just indulge me and reverse the arrows? If D is meant to happen, B will happen, C will happen, A will happen. And so then I once remember this man who wrote this book, Shantaram Gregory. My ex-boss who knew him and who knows everybody, he said to me that, come, you want to meet Gregory. So Aparna and I both took our copies of Shantaram and went to see him. And there he was living the way it was, and his story. And so one day I asked him, I said, do you believe in destiny? Because here you are sitting in this lovely Malabar apartment after everything you've been through in life. And he said a rather complicated answer, which ended with, I believe in the strength of the human mind. So I went to my teacher and I said, I met him and this is what he said. So he said, just go and ask Gregory, in which shop did you buy the strength of the human mind? And then when I think about it, in which shop do you buy resilience? In which shop do you buy the ability to not fall apart? In which shop do you buy the emotional strength? In which shop do you buy the blessings of Saraswati dancing on your tongue? I mean, in which shop do you buy these? And I think the answer is you don't buy them in a shop. It's the great Ovarian lottery, whatever, randomness, call it what you will. A divine force, I mean, depends on what you believe in. But, like I say, I've now lived, as I tell some of my friends and I talk, that we've now lived long enough to know that shit happens in life. As much as the good things happen. And so to come back to your original question, and people often ask me, how do you do all this? I don't do it, it does me. And that's in my construct, I call it her largesse. Because I just feel that it's her largesse. So yes, I do listen to and try and learn the traditional South Indian stuff. I mean, I love the Lalita Sahasranamam. I try and translate it for myself. I try and understand it. I listen to lectures when I have the time to do it. Sometimes I don't want to do any of this stuff. Then I binge on Netflix. That is my daily routine.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for giving me, I think, giving us your whole and time. So what will the sari icon, I didn't touch upon it so far, but I think we've all grown up admiring this lady who's been bold in her saris, worn the most beautiful one, and a lot of time a vermilion on your your forehead as well. And so you were a style icon for us when growing up, inspiring us to wear our saris. And So, what will the sari icon legend of today, to borrow your own words, tell the Gulti girl with 3 sets of clothes? How will you guide her today?
Well, all I will tell her is that you got damn lucky. It's been an amazing life. I think more than everybody, and that's what my batchmates and I often talk about, because now we're all sort of in various stages of retirement, that we've all got to places we never in our wildest dreams thought we'd get to. And that is just so extraordinary. And I also think that the one thing that stays with you is just the love that, it sounds cliched, but I noticed in my daughter's wedding when she said, oh, it's my wedding, it's my wedding. I said, no, it's not. I said, for us, it is a celebration of the people who are with us on this journey through life, who have given us so much love, laughter, this, that. And it's that journey we want to celebrate, using your wedding as an excuse. Because to us, this is a big deal, and we want to share our big deal with everybody who made our lives come this far. So that's really what it is. So, you know, you're incidental to it, so just suck it up. I want to have 900 people at your wedding. I will have 900 people for Dad as well as for me. So I think what I would say is, you know, don't worry, life is unpredictable. Worry because that's what you do, you worry, but life is unpredictable and you will get to where you get to depending on the luck of the draw. Navigational principles, not destination. And change your navigational principles, change your preferred destination. Don't be afraid to change who you are. You can't have the same goals and navigational principles at 60 that you had at 30, right?
Yeah.
And so the stages of life will take care of themselves. And I think if it is Vanaprastha time, it is Vanaprastha time. You can decide Vanaprastha is with your Netflix and your, you know, your home in the Nilgiris, or Vanaprastha is something more substantial and less flaky. But you have to get off the stage. You have to get off the stage when you have to get off the stage, right? You have to. And that is life, yeah. So I would say don't sweat it. Don't sweat it, it'll happen. Don't sweat it. As we say, whatever has to happen will happen. Okay. Right? Yeah. So, on that note.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Absolute pleasure.
Thank lovely. You so much. Thank you.
And that's a wrap to another value-packed conversation at VWP. It was such a pleasure and privilege to be in conversation with this legendary thought leader. We spoke to her about being an author, about being an independent director, and a teacher at one of India's top management institutes. Her insights into market research, business consulting, and consumer centricity was pure gold. But you know, my favorite takeaway from her life, it is to embrace life as it happens and know and fully appreciate that challenges can come your way. Focusing on the navigational principles, doing your best you can in the given circumstances, and not sweating it out about things outside of your control were very noteworthy learnings. We're very excited and looking forward to our next podcast as well, which promises to be an interesting episode. If you are listening to our content and watching our podcast, please do like, share, and subscribe to our channel, The We Women Project. It lets us know that there's somebody listening and gives us the confidence to create more content. So signing off and goodbye till the next episode. This is your host, V.